3, 2, 1.
Dom
and Johnny.
Dom and Johnny.
Dom and 3, 2. Dom and Johnny in the morning. So today's topic, because it is top of mind, I thought we could talk about tournament competition.
Woo!
Because there are lots of ways, to practice the martial arts, to express your art in different ways. Some styles really prioritize the more practical self-defense stuff. We've talked about there are more combat sport martial arts versus traditional martial arts. I think both of which have a tournament expression. So I figured we'd start with just what's the value of competing?
Well, at least for me, it's all about the preparation.
Mm-hmm.
No, that's not true. I just lied. I think it's half about the preparation. So I think when you prepare your form, and usually most of the black belts will say that the forms they feel most comfortable with are the ones they prepared for tournament competition, just because they put so much work into it. And I think that's huge. I think that's what takes you to the next level. It's when you put something in front of you where you're kind of forced to rise to the occasion. So it makes you put a little extra effort in. And then I think the other half of it is just putting yourself in a situation where you are incredibly uncomfortable. And I think that's the second half of that coin. Whether it be in sparring, where you're sparring full speed with someone you don't know, and there's definitely a massive level of discomfort, and you're also no longer in zone 2. You're not training anymore. This is like zone 4. This is where you're testing everything to see if if what you were doing has worked, or if there's areas you need to improve in. Hint, hint. There's always areas you need to improve in. And then with forms, it's the same thing. You've got, anywhere between 10 people to 200 people staring at you, depending on what division you're in. And that can be incredibly nerve-wracking. And most people that do their forms, myself included, don't remember doing it. You just kind of black out because your body goes into that zone 4. It's just doing what it knows.
Yeah.
So I think those two things, at least for me, are the biggest part. Is the preparation and then just being in that, high intensity zone.
Yeah. Well, and just to kind of just in case we're speaking to anybody that's unfamiliar with competition, at least for the tournaments we participate in, there are usually a few different events that you can compete with. First is kata, which is everyone does a form one at a time, and they get judged on it, and then they get ranked. Usually it's there are the 4 best and then everybody else. So, and then sparring, you wear gear. It's not like MMA where you just have gloves and you're just pounding at each other. And it's point fighting, so it does, when someone has scored a point, or if a judge thinks they saw a point, they will come up, decide who had the better technique or whatever. And then, of course, some tournaments you have weapons competitions, so you basically perform a kata that includes a weapon. And then there have been other ones throughout the years, like one of the divisions is musical creative forms, as in you're creating a form yourself and choreographing it to music. We've had synchronized forms divisions before. You come up as a team and perform a form that's synchronized to music. So there are all sorts of ways that you can compete. Just to unpack the language of zones for a minute, this is a newer idea relative to a lot of things we talk about that our teacher, Ken Caputo, has talked about a lot, which is he competes in Spartan races. And so a huge part of that is running. So part of his training has a lot to do with stride efficiency and cardiovascular strengthening. And when you look at efficient cardio training, you have different zones of exertion. And so when you say zone 2, from a cardio perspective, it's kind of like brisk walking, where you can hold a conversation, but you are walking. Like there's a little bit of exertion. And then zone 3 would be you're exerting enough that it's starting to get difficult to talk. So you're starting to get out of breath. And then zone 5, to just kind of figure out where zone 4 is. Zone 5 you can only maintain in bursts because it's full exertion. Like you're trying to basically redline for little bits of time. And so the idea with cardio training, there's a lot of research that's pointing to you want to spend about 80% of your time in zone 2. You don't want to overly push it because that leads to things like burnout, which then is an inefficient way to train. So it's interesting that you say zone 4 because I agree. I think the translation into martial arts practice, zone 5 is the fight. Like someone's trying to take your head off. So you're hitting them as hard as you can. And even in competition sparring, at the black belt level, you're allowed light contact. If you hit hard enough, like say you hit them and their body moves, that's actually grounds for disqualification if you're doing it gross negligently. So a lot of times, it is zone 4 where you're moving really fast, but there is a level of control where you're not supposed to like knock out your partner. It's not like a competitive boxing match, which I would argue would be probably closest to zone 5 as you can do, and is also pretty unsafe because you're getting hit in the head really hard over and over again. Even with pads, it's a pretty dangerous thing. I think the point of the zones in cardio training is as just a metaphor for the level of intensity that you train and perform at in the martial arts. So as a martial arts analog, it's not always literally how fast your heart is going, but it can be more just like, it's performing your form in front of a crowd is there's a lot more pressure than doing it on your own within a crowded class, which is also going to be different than leading a class. Like if you're the one responsible for teaching it. So but the idea is just mostly the proportions. Like if most of your training is just when you're up competing, like you don't prepare it at all, then you're less likely to perform really well. You'll probably be in more of a zone 4, zone 5 state of intensity, but you haven't done the zone 2 training that's going to make it all work. So, and it does make sense from like just like you have to balance the system before you add energy into it. You have to make sure the tires are secured to the wheel properly before you go 65 miles an hour. Like it just, it makes sense on a lot of fronts. It's just a lot of times I think a lot of people in our culture, and by that I mean world culture, there seems to be this idea that if you try harder, you get more success. And it's not about necessarily trying harder, it's about doing the right thing at the right time, with an acknowledgement that there's a certain element of luck in it as well. I think another value of competition is just that. It pushes you to do your best performance, whether or not you're in the top 4, because ultimately the individual judges you happen to have assigned to your ring can just not like the things that you're emphasizing. One example is we have a form 6 kata, and it has this really long opening breathing sequence. And I remember my parents saying they overheard parents of a student that didn't train at our school saying that they don't like doing that section with long breathing. They do it more dynamically where it looks like they're kind of hitting and it's like a lot quicker and they speed through that part. So if you have a judge from a school like that and, we're taking our time and breathing and building and all that stuff, even though that's the way your teacher taught it, that just is a mismatch with what the judge's expectations are. So it's just luck of the draw sometimes, Yeah,
I'm seeing that a lot too now with even with my Marlboro kids.
Yeah.
Because we all train so differently. I think the ones that are going to the international are going to fare pretty well. They look really good. But we do the forms a lot different than a lot of Massachusetts.
Mm-hmm.
So that might be interesting. Because I would say that the international, though it's an international, I feel like Connecticut is the majority of their participants, or at least
Yeah.
a good portion of it. Especially with the tournament being held in Connecticut and run by Master David Shirley, I feel like a lot of Connecticutites, Connecticut, end up going there. And the kids I teach very much do their forms like the Connecticut crew. So we only have 3 going, but when we do the regional, which we're going to push a little harder, I think it's going to be interesting.
Yeah.
Because they do move a little bit different than the kids from the other schools. So I'm curious to see how that works out.
Yeah, well, and it largely has to do just with, like, geography. Like, if you mostly train in California, there is a lot of work to go to a tournament in Connecticut, Even though it's open to everyone, it's a lot easier for people who live in Connecticut to drive to the tournament. Like,
It's like they should call it the New England, like all New Englands or something.
Oh.
I feel like that's where we get we get New
Yeah.
York people there too, though. So
Well, and again, there is a large amount of overlap, like you mentioned. A lot of black belts will say their most comfortable forms are ones they've prepared for competition, and also, it's a Venn diagram without a complete overlap. There are some things you prepare for competition you would not want to do if you were training fighting application. A really good example is, you do it in your form, and it's beautiful every time you do it. That, like, if you can nail a side kick and hold it for an extra second in order to create a snapshot in the judge's mind, for a forms competition, it's demonstrating superior strength, flexibility, and stability. It's a very cool thing to be able to do. In a fight, you wouldn't want to stick your leg out and hold it there because then somebody can grab it or trap it or do all sorts of bad things to it. So a lot of times, as martial artists in this style, what we're reconciling is how much attention and preparation do we want to put in for competition versus, is that going to be disruptive somehow to our self-defense development? And I do think that you can do both without sacrificing the other, but it is kind of like a Goldilocks thing. If you spend 99% of your time with your feet really underneath you so you can stay mobile, you may not be training the deep, low, wide stances that look impressive in a competition. Likewise, if all you're doing is competing for performances and you don't get used to having punches thrown at you, your martial art is gonna become more of a dance than it is a martial art.
Yeah, I think people forget that part a lot because there are so many facets to martial arts that are so beneficial.
Yeah.
And you could easily train, up to high ranks of black belt without ever really caring about the fight part of it. However, it is a martial art, in its very definition. It's an art of war. So it doesn't have to be why you do it, but it's still there.
Yeah. Well, and it is interesting. There have been a few conversations over the years. Adults that have quit at first degree black belt because the fighting part was so integral to the progression that they were just uncomfortable with a lot of the violence that was becoming less and less veiled.
They didn't notice it after 10 or 11 combination?
Well, I think it's one of those things you can notice it, but there's a different level of intensity.
Oh, yeah.
When you're like a brown belt and you're just trying to scoop the leg over and you're just more worried about the positioning and stuff, that's one level. But when you have to get into the mentality of being willing to harm or worse, another person, and that's like tapping into that energy as part of progression. People have varying levels of comfort whether or not that's a skill set worth developing.
Well, at least, even up to black belt, those skills will benefit them for the rest of their lives. So
absolutely.
It's too bad they didn't want to continue, but at the same time,
Well, yeah, and it's why are you doing it? So if it's the health and wellness stuff, or, I think of, we had a first degree adult who stopped training, I want to say at least 15 years ago, and she was hiking and fell. She was, and just slapped out and maybe, saved her definitely from really bad injury. So yeah, these skills do stick around, and even if you're not interested in the maiming people part, um, yeah. That being said, that's also why I find it so valuable not only to compete, but also compete in both forms and in sparring. I know there have been instructors in the past that have said, if you don't like sparring, at least do forms. If you don't like forms, at least do sparring. Even if you think you're terrible at forms, I think it's so valuable to compete in it. And the reason is because it is a personal pressure test. So sparring will let you know where your reflexes stand, Even if you don't win the match, even if you get shut out 3-0, you get a snapshot of matchups that are favorable or unfavorable to help guide your training. I think the forms part of it is it's the psychological violence that you're learning to overcome rather than the physical one. So that's why I also understand different tournaments have different levels of intensity. Our school does a spring tournament. It's very small. It's only us and one other school. That one, I'm like, there's no reason not to compete in that one because the judges are all very equal in terms of intensity. It's kind of light and fun. If you're worried about getting your nose bloodied, there are some tournaments you probably shouldn't do, at least right now. but yeah, overall, like I really do think that like forms and sparring, they offer kind of like a complete picture by doing both. And then if you also want to throw weapons into it, I just think it's interesting to do.
I do too. And I was doing bow staff this weekend with the Black Belt Club crew, and I was using like a really like nice, thick, heavy staff, and we were just doing the basics. And we're doing some of the dropping strikes and the rising strikes and the across strikes, and I could feel my forearms just burning.
Yeah.
I was like, yes. And I was like, this is awesome. And then even just running through the form, I feel like it builds so many necessary muscles, especially in the first second of the movement, because we typically operate kind of on that loose, tense, loose basis. So we're not squeezing our muscles the whole way through. But that first movement with a staff, that initial acceleration movement, I think, especially if you're doing that with a heavier staff, then drilling that for a while, then getting off and just throwing some front punches, I think you'll notice a pretty significant difference in speed. And I think when you prep it for a tournament, you exaggerate all those things. So you're exaggerating the low stances, and you have to move this heavy staff. So I think there's a ton of benefit from doing weapons. And then on the sport weapons side, which I don't do a lot of anymore, but I will acknowledge that it will take your coordination, your hand-eye coordination, to another level.
The other thing that I love about weapons competition, especially as you get more advanced, like in the ranks, is just how varied it can be. Mm-hmm. So, if you're running, let's say, a green belt forms ring, you're pretty much going to be looking at 2 katas, 3 pinions, and statue of the cranes. Like, everyone's going to be doing pretty much one of those 3 forms. So a lot of times you're kind of comparing apples to apples, and whether you're a spectator or a judge, there is something kind of fun to compare apples to oranges to pineapples. So, if someone's doing a Shaolin broadsword form and someone else is doing a sport karate bow staff form, and a third person is doing, some traditional Okinawan nunchuck form, those are 3 very different weapons in 3 very different styles with competitors that are accentuating 3 very different principles. So there's like a dynamicness in being able to watch and judge and decide, first of all, what was this person going for? Was this person doing something more complex versus another person's simpler form but better execution? I really like being a competitor in weapons because sometimes you don't feel like, my three pinion is just worse than everybody else's three pinion. Sometimes you just get to enjoy being a fan of everybody else's form, and just however it shakes out. But there's something about the variety that makes it easier not to take a loss personally, and also not overly identify with getting a win. I mean, obviously there have been some times you've seen someone do a weapon form and they just flat out crush everybody else. But like, for the most part, I feel like it's a strangely balanced competition, in the way that, like, it's not like that person just has low stances, so they're gonna be better, like they're gonna be scored better. It's you have a lot of different ways that you can try to express the principles that you are strong with.
And just take that another level, even though I do agree with you. It is interesting because there are many open tournaments where they are separated, and the divisions will be Chinese weapons and Japanese weapons.
No.
Yeah, so in that way, I think, being more flowy with the Chinese weapons and being more, sticky. I don't know what to say.
Yeah.
With the
chunky. We'll go with chunky versus flowy.
Yes.
Yeah.
A nice chunky Japanese form.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I think that's kind of cool. But you're right. It is neat. The weapons division is such a hodgepodge of weapons and styles. It's cool.
Dom and Johnny in the morning.